I feel like, the topic of thermal hubs has been something that's very popular in the last couple of years and it's brought up a lot. But thermal hubs, for me at least, they don't always have to be this perfect, three ridges dumping down, like a little bottom spot. There's so many variations and small, thermal hubs or bigger ones, and some that are a little tighter, some are a little wider. So kind of explain what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean the ones that I see that are, I mean, you've got like 5 or 6 different ones basically. You've got some thermal hubs that have that are basically like a small creek bottom, so they're wider at the bottom. They're more expansive. You can have a very large thermal hub that's like a creek bottom itself, and when it turns, then if it turns at a 90-degree angle, you've built a thermal hub from that turn back upstream. If it turns and there's a ridge that comes down in front of the creek itself, so it's turning into a creek channel, it'll stop that wind flow at that point, and everything upstream of that, it turns into a thermal hub, and you'll see those areas being used just like the smaller thermal hubs. So you got those that are creek bottom based, and you got the kind that are just like larger. They look like a hand, like you put your hand down on the table, and they look like the fingers going out, and they have a flat bottom. And it may be a wider flat bottom, maybe up to 50, 60, 70 yards wide at times here, what I see. And those are used a certain way. And then you have them that are kind of more compact from that, and they're U-shaped. That's what I call a U-shaped one. And it's just like you take the big hand and you just shrunk it down into a smaller dimension. And then you have the V-shaped, which are the ones where the sides come down, just like I say, into a V. And those may not have water in them running all the time. Neither will the U-shaped one sometimes, but if the U-shaped one has a ditch or something like that that's a focal point for it, those are going to be ones you're going to key on. Anywhere you can get a ditch, it's going to pull that extra amount of thermal down into them. So if you can get the lowest point, so if you've got a U-shaped thermal that's got a ditch or something like that, and you really want to pay more attention to that, and the V-shaped ones are the same way. They flow a little bit differently because they are kind of more compact. You'll get what I've seen, you'll get more of a quicker movement of the thermal. So the thermal is just like anything else. It's just like water. You got to think of that thermal as water. So the first portion that's going to start moving downward is going to be your higher elevation. So like if you have a U-shaped thermal with several V-shaped thermals parting off of it, those V-shaped thermals are going to be the first ones that start dropping. Now, if they're facing south or west, that changes because you're going to get the sunlight in the evening that's casting in those higher elevations, and you're going to get a reverse of that. So you're going to see the lower elevations start creeping up first and then working into it. So that's where I'm saying your orientation of your thermals plays a big portion of what you're going to see as far as when those deer move into those areas and when that thermal shift happens. So if you got an east facing or a north facing thermal hub, or basically a multi faceted thermal hub where you got a U shaped with several V shaped thermal hubs attached to it, is facing east or north, the upper elevations are going to start, the thermals are going to start dropping before the lower elevations will, and then it'll trickle down. But if it's south or west facing toward the sun, it's going to be reversed. You're going to see the lower elevations start dropping first and then working their way up into the higher elevation, and that affects how the deer move.
Okay. So, all right. So when you're talking about like the places that are like the west facing and stuff, and you're talking how that's going to drop first and affect the way that the deer move, how does that affect how the deer are moving in those particular areas?
Well, like if you've got a west facing, sun setting in the west, of course, all this changes. I'm talking about when you're having, say, 25 or greater percent of sunlight, so that you got a pretty much partly sunny to mostly sunny day. If you get cloudy day, then everything changes, and the thermals can really go kind of wonky. But if all things considered, you got a partly cloudy to mostly sunny day, if you've got a west-facing thermal, like when I say west-facing, I mean the opening of the hub is facing toward the west, and everything else is flowing east or northeast or southeast. The first portion that's going to start dropping the thermals is going to be the closest to the opening of the hub, where the dump out point of all that is. And so what happens is in those areas, that's where the deer are going to, like a mature buck. I'm only applying this to mostly mature bucks because I think they're the only ones that really, I think the other deer use thermals, but I think they really don't know enough about them, or don't. It doesn't play a big a part in their travel the way a mature buck has learned his craft. So
Mm-hmm.
this is applying only to just mature bucks. They seek out those places first. So where the thermals drop first, that's going to be their first area. So it's just like that video that I done. That buck knew to get into that thermal hub at a certain time. He had, it wasn't like on a clock or anything like that, but instinctually and through, I guess, the knowledge that he had built up over the years of using these things, he knew to get into that thermal hub at that time because he never moved into that thermal hub any other time. It was only when that thermal switch was about to hit that he moved into it. So those wider thermal hubs like that, if they're facing west, that drop, the lower end drops first, they're going to be in that lower elevation. That's where I think a lot of people get picked off. I know I did when I was younger because those things just looked, it's like, oh, there's so much sign down there, like
Yeah.
I just got to dive right into it, And the thing is, the buck was already there. He's just waiting for that thermal shift. So he's somewhere within relation to that thermal hub, knowing that, hey, at this particular time, this thermal hub is going to start working in my favor. I'm going to be able to scent check everything that's upwind or up in elevation above this thermal hub. I'm going to be able to check it from this location. I got to get down there. If that's in his route of travel for that day. So that's basically how they use it. I think they're already kind of getting into the thermal hub where they can see it, scent check it, things like that. And once that shift hits, that's when they start their movement. That's why a lot of these GPS studies show, and especially in the early season, that a mature buck will only move like 150 to 200 yards during daylight. So kind of the hypothesis that I've come up with is that 150 to 200 yards of movement. If you look at the GPS data, they're usually higher in elevation, and usually they're dropping down to somewhere else, like a secondary bed. In a lot of those GPS studies, you can't really see the topographical features. But when I'm
Mm-hmm.
doing my camera work, that's what I've kind of keyed in on, is that movement and trying to predict that. And that's what I'm seeing play out, is they're up in that higher elevation, and right before that thermal drop, they'll move out of that midday bed into a bed that's more, I guess, closely related as far as travel distance to that thermal hub, where they can quickly get into that thermal hub and then go back up into the ridges, if that makes sense.
Okay. So basically they're bedding kind of above that a ways. They may not be able to necessarily see the hub at the beginning, but as right before that thermal shift tends to happen, they're using that upward thermals to kind of move down into position where they can get a visual even on the, like,
Yeah,
say, scrape or the bottom of that hub, and then as it shifts they can smell everything above them, and then they might make a little bit of a, movement, just
yeah.
before dark there, and then kind of go into position.
Yeah, yeah, they really give you that. We always say they give you that short window of time. Well, that if you're trying to hunt a thermal hub, that's your short window. And that's really the only window you have. If you don't take advantage of that window in that thermal hub, that's really the only window you have, because that buck at that point in time is traveling with the thermals itself. He's trying to get to a point below the area that he may be bedded or staged in. Sometimes they just kind of stage and hang out in those upper thermal hubs, and they'll wait and move down. I've seen that as well. But you got to play that into effect, that he's at a disadvantage traveling down with the thermal current to a point that he believes, I can get everything that's above me, that has now shifted, that thermal has dropped enough that I can get to that position to get as much information, because that's all he's wanting to do, is get information. It's just like us.
Yep.
That bird to get every bit of information from the largest amount of terrain that he can gather without having to do the least amount of work to do it.